To act in time.
Acting in time.
Acted in time.
Act in time.
Acting in time.
The looming crises, can we act in time?
This is a very important topic, this whole idea of looming disasters and how you deal with them and whether they can be dealt with in time.
This was inspired by actually a range of issues, but let's start with one very obvious one. Hurricane Katrina was a great tragedy that inflicted enormous damage on New Orleans. And what's even more striking about the situation involving Hurricane Katrina was that everyone knew it would happen, and it could happen. And yet, no one acted in time to prevent it. And even just a moment's reflection indicates that there are many such crises on the horizon. They're the kind of things that you see coming. You know it's going to happen, and yet we at times seem unwilling or unable to act. The school last year embarked on a project trying to understand these things and, more importantly, identify cases of them, but very importantly, look for solutions, look for answers.
The question before the House this morning, therefore, is can we act in time to prevent a nuclear bomb exploding in one of our cities?
3 months from yesterday, it'll be 62 years since a bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 months from day after tomorrow, it'll be 62 years since the last bomb was ever used in warfare. So the question is, can we go another 60 years without any nuclear weapons being used? I want to find some way to educate the leaders of Iran and North Korea. North Korea has nuclear weapons. Iran is going to have nuclear weapons. And I want them to be as sophisticated and thoughtful as could be.
Nuclear terrorism. This is a catastrophe that could be prevented by a feasible, affordable agenda of actions, some of which we're not taking at all, and others of which we're not taking fast enough. So it's not like we don't know what to do, it's just we don't do it.
So what can the state do as the public funds are decreasing for critical infrastructure and homeland security generally? It is simply incumbent, either through, I think, regulations, law, or just sheer the ask to get the private sector to start to regulate itself on these high critical infrastructure places, whether they're chemical or nuclear facilities. So what we had happen about a week ago in Massachusetts was Entergy, the company in Pilgrim, offering about $8 million over the course of a couple years to support an emergency operations center in Pilgrim. Because that makes a lot of sense for the city, it makes a lot of sense for the town, and it's a small ask of a large company.
The issues in today's discussion arise from a research project which is part of the Dean's Acting in Time enterprise. And we observed that there was a collection of things that might happen which one can reasonably well foresee events of this kind taking place. And there are things that we could do to make ourselves better organized as a society, as a nation, to be prepared to respond and thereby reduce the amount of damage, dislocation, disruption, and so on that would occur from these events. And yet we see much work that still needs to be done.
That is the acting in time question. There are technical answers to almost every problem we've talked about. The problem we've been focused on is not what is the technical answer, but why don't we do anything about it?
It's very hard to get people to connect current action or inaction with consequences that are decades away.
I believe whenever you're trying to get somebody involved in a disaster that's not imminent, you have to play on their imminent interest if such are available.
Imagine a world in which you woke up this morning and the news broadcast was catastrophe, 5,000 dead this morning, and another 1 million taken ill. And by the way, that's same 5,000 deaths will happen tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after. And by the way, all of those deaths and the vast majority of those sick people, we know how to avoid. In fact, we have avoided in many parts of the world. We have learned how, at one point, to cure and prevent malaria. And of course, malaria is the case of these deaths that I'm referring to.
This whole weekend has been about acting in time. And when people think about natural disasters, they tend to think about what should we do now that the natural disaster is looming. But we think that it's important to worry about acting before, during, and after a natural disaster.
We're also looking at how we recover from the past. So if we don't act in time, how can we act now to recover from the things we didn't act in time over? This is Beta Mine. This single mine is the top taxpayer liability in the United States. And there's hundreds of these sites in the American West.
The federal government in the 1950s and 60s acted in time in a very significant way for Bill Clinton, and a very significant way for my life as well. We grew up in the South in a time of revolution. The changes in race relations that transformed America and our own lives happened as they did in no small part because of critical federal, executive, legislative, and judicial interventions. When Eisenhower surprised even himself, I think, to send the 101st Airborne and a federalized National Guard to Little Rock in September 1957, Eisenhower acted in time to prevent an escalation of violence and to demonstrate that federal power would be used to make fundamental changes in American life.
Every responsible president essentially has to allocate time and attention and resources to three separate areas. One, you want to do what you ran for office to do, what you told the voters you'd do. Two, you have to deal with what happens. Those two things alone are enough to take up 100% of your time and then some. The problem is that you have a third responsibility, and that is to think about the long-term problems that are coming at the world that you have to try to begin to avert.
I use this metaphor of we're driving a car with bad brakes toward a cliff in the fog. And the fog is the scientific uncertainty that prevents us from knowing exactly where the cliff is. We don't know what the temperature level is at which catastrophic disintegration of the West Antarctic ice sheet or the Greenland ice sheet would occur. We don't know what the temperature is at which we might get a huge outpouring of methane from clathrates and carbon dioxide from under the permafrost is. But any sensible person driving in a car with bad brakes toward a cliff in the fog would be in favor of putting on the brakes, even if you're not entirely sure that it will be in time to keep you from going over the cliff.
I have a good news, bad news story to tell you. The good news is that there really is a lot going on, and people and leaders here in the United States and around the world are taking initiative, demanding leadership, and trying to act in time. But all of these efforts are still too fragmented, too inconsistent, and are adding up to too little to seriously address the scale of the climate change problem.
I don't think it's a question of whether we can solve them, it's just a question of actually getting on with it and doing it. I think what we need to do right now, as Kelly said, is actually get something like 20 different industrial scale projects. I don't mean little DOE test facilities. I'm talking about 20 coal-burning power plants that capture carbon, inject at scale, so that a decade from now we know the pitfalls. We know what works, we know what doesn't work, we know where it's not a good idea to inject the carbon and where it might be a good idea to inject more carbon. And I think we can learn that in a decade, because we need this technology as soon as possible.
The role of the private sector. President Mogai talked about foreign direct investment. There's been a lot of talk about the role of private companies. And he talked about, really importantly, there are different kinds of foreign direct investment, right? There's kinds that don't multiply, and there are kinds that do multiply through. Danny Roderick made the importance of not having pat answers to the role of the private sector or of industrial growth. These are not going to be one formula, one size fits all. That the importance of solving this acting in time problem is about individual attention to individual countries. But I couldn't end this without pointing out that Nancy McGregor from the floor, Graham Allison, Beck Hamilton talked about the private sector in the nonprofit private sector and the important role there. And I just remind you what Graham Allison said in response to Nancy's question, I think it was, that the role of civil society was about sustaining solutions. And that role of civil society groups, NGOs, professional associations, being the long-term sustainers of spasmodic, periodic government and other action is one to take away.
So these are different kinds of disasters, but you have to be aware of them. And part of the obligation of those of us who have more free time to read, to learn, to assimilate all this, is to make sure that people who are out there killing themselves just to pay the bills, but are trying to be good citizens, are trying to raise their children well, do show up to vote in elections, understand this. Understand that they are part of a collective mass of decisions that are leading us to a disaster.